All right, cool. So let's dive into Spotify, a Swedish legend of a company, an iconic company, and their early days. So, how was Spotify able to win in the music streaming industry when no one else was able to? And, why didn't a US company emerge quite as big as Spotify in recent years as being the main place to go to stream your music? So, this is an awesome story. I highly recommend checking out the Netflix miniseries, The Playlist, that kind of does a dramatized documentary of this and goes through Daniel Ek and his story, the visionary CEO of the company, as well as many of the other players who played a role in the early days of Spotify's founding. So if we just kind of try to do a little mini history lesson here, Spotify was founded around the time when the Pirate Bay was really the main player. When you would go on the Pirate Bay and you would download all your music and then upload it to your MP3 player or play it on your computer. And this was a time when the large record companies were getting totally smashed because their business models were based on selling CDs and albums and completely controlling the music and who had access to it. And now with the internet, they had lost control of their catalog of music, and it was now getting downloaded for free around the world. And the record companies were incredibly hesitant to work with any of these platforms, and Spotify managed to emerge. Basically, from my understanding, both studying this a little bit and watching that documentary, Spotify started out wanting to also be a free music service, just with a much better user interface and much better experience. So when you looked at the Pirate Bay, you go on, you search a song, you identify what file you want to download. You're then torrenting that from whatever other users have it around the internet, and could be potentially a virus. Could take a very long time to download, and then you finally got it. So it's a long process to get the music that you wanted. And Spotify was able to build a hybrid peer-to-peer network that allowed you to stream this music with almost no buffering. So basically they both had a beautiful UI that was like the perfect music player, as well as an incredible technical architecture that made it so they had essentially no buffering, because the buffering time was so low, the human brain can barely perceive anything below, I believe it was like 2 milliseconds or something that they were trying to hit, and they got very close to that target. So they started out looking at doing servers, and in a server network, you have all your music in servers, and then you just stream. You select the music you want, and you're routed to that song, and the server sends you that. The problem with that business model is, at the time of Spotify's founding, server space was too expensive for that to make sense. So they had to try to do a peer-to-peer network model. And they worked with, and I believe they purchased uTorrent early on, one of the major torrenting sites that also had a peer-to-peer network, to kind of learn that architecture. And so what they did is they would use that peer-to-peer network, and they would use learning techniques, algorithms, simpler algorithms, to identify what music a user liked. So if I'm going in and I want to play some electronic music or some AC/DC or whatever it might be, Spotify is going to know that that's what Michael likes to play. So it's already going to have those kind of prioritized and buffering and ready to go, so that it can identify that and get it ready to play. But on about 10% of searches, I'm going to search something totally different than what I usually listen to. And that's the real problem, where they couldn't really engineer the system to predict what you wanted to listen to. They couldn't kind of front load that to you so that it was ready to play. And what they did is they did a fallback method, where then they would have a server that would handle those kind of long tail searches. That was one innovation. But there was also something really cool they did, and it was done really well in this mini series. But essentially the internet has a protocol called TCP, right? And TCP controls the flow of the internet, kind of like a traffic light. And the internet was made to safely send information from here to here without losing any of that information. And so it lets you know when it's a green light, send the information at this, miles per hour, so to say, or this frequency of packets that you're sending. And what Spotify was able to do was actually design their own protocol that kind of broke the speed limit, and when the light turned yellow, sped up and tried to send information at a higher rate. And so they prioritized the first part of songs and really didn't care if they lost a little bit of data, because it wasn't really you couldn't perceive it as a user. What you could perceive was a long lag for the song starting. But as long as you hear that guitar start or that beat start going, you're not going to notice if a little bit of the song is slightly different because a small amount of data was lost in that transfer. So I believe they actually patented that protocol, and they might have there was some other frameworks developed by Google as well that were kind of similar, where they were losing some data but prioritizing speed. But there was both a beautiful UI and incredible technical innovation in what went into Spotify, as well as just relentlessly getting said no to and pushing forward and eventually securing some great partnerships. So, Emmanuel, maybe you can talk about how they were able to get partnerships with these record labels in Europe in order to secure these music catalogs.
Yeah, I kind of got lost while you were explaining about the technical aspect, because it was so interesting. I actually didn't look at that part at all. But yeah, going
Is there
into
any questions you had about it? I mean,
Oh no, not at all. It was just super interesting. It was very interesting, and I kind of I was kind of
a lot of it is covered in the playlist, so you can check that out. They do a really good a good job rather of covering like what they did technically in order to solve this. So yeah, it's really impressive, and some good information I was never aware of. So
yeah. Okay, but yeah, so their initial partners, right? So I think obviously, they joined the industry when where piracy was a huge thing. Mm-hmm. But I think the timing of it was also really, really good, because essentially what happened is that CD sales were decreasing, especially for like the big four back then, Universal, they still are, Universal Music Group, Sony Music, Warner Music Group, and what was the last one? EMI.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically, they didn't have anything to lose when Spotify came up to them and was like, "Hey, would you like to partner up with us?" And they gave them a back catalog, telling them, "Hey, you can use this catalog and put them on your Spotify platform." And that's how it kind of started out, how it started to grow. And basically, all this was mainly focused on growing their freemium model. So that's how Spotify started to grow in the early days, towards 2006 to 2010.
Mm-hmm.
And you can kind of tie it with the product market fit.
Definitely. Yeah. So another interesting bit from the miniseries. So Spotify wanted to be basically like the Pirate Bay, but a way better user experience. They wanted to be free. And the development team especially really believed in that. They wanted to be free. They wanted to kind of say F you to the labels and be free. But there's no business model behind being free. So they eventually had to find a way to actually make money. And unless this miniseries is just totally messing with me, which I think it was very grounded in facts, basically what they did there is they made it free to go on and to play music. But when you build out your playlist, you have to pay in order to build out those playlists. And that was a very interesting strategy, because then they could really get people on and using it and maybe they allowed you to build one playlist or whatever, but they started to charge you the Spotify fee in order to build playlists and to maintain your playlists and add on to them. And so that was kind of their early innovation. And obviously they went on to then, not be free and to charge money and just win on user experience. So really interesting stuff. And that, maybe that's a good transition. And they, went into the United States and were able to succeed there. I think, Emmanuel, you did some research on some of the critical partnerships that they did there in order to really get a foothold.
Yeah, exactly. Before I dive into this, you don't have to go back to the previous slide, but something that I found really interesting was that, and I didn't know this before, and don't quote me on this either because I'm not sure if it's 100% fact, but what I didn't know is that these big four, they used to be the largest shareholders of Spotify because of this deal that they had with them. And then for me, it was kind of opening my eyes, and I was like, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. But now coming back to this part. So what happened is that Spotify, wanted to tap to the US market. They haven't launched at all yet there. So what they decided to do is they decided to partner up with brands such as Coca-Cola, Chevrolet, and Reebok. There's a whole list of these companies that they partnered up with, but I'm just mentioning a couple. And the whole idea was to advertise this digital product into the US. And something else that they did is they also leveraged virality in their sign-up process by allowing users to invite friends, which also helped ramp up early growth very, very quickly. And something that I find also kind of interesting is that now we're fast forwarding to 2011 to 2014. And there was a point where Spotify now tried to actually launch in the United States and build an office there. But there was a main concern with the big four that were trying to sort out a deal for this to happen. And maybe nowadays we see it in a different view because we are in this digital era. But back then, what happened was that the big four, they were actually quite interested in signing the deal. They saw the potential that Spotify had. The only issue was that when looking at their finances, they only saw a 70% margin, which for back then, all the other companies that used to be brick and mortar, they were like, this is not worth investing in. There's no traction underneath this. And I find it quite interesting and a little bit hilarious, but I think also I saw a post somewhere about someone mentioning that back then, I think it was Dropbox, when that came out, it was some sort of a similar discussion that investors back then were also looking at it or frowned upon it just a little bit. And then they realized that, hold on a minute, 6%, 7% isn't that crazy, especially in the digital market industry. And then basically what happened, at some point they were able to sort out a deal, but I'm not sure if I'm talking too much about this yet. We can jump to the next slide, or
no, this is great overview.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. And from the miniseries as well, they were major investors who then jumped in and got a big piece of this in order to get it to where it is today. And Spotify today, I believe, is headquartered in New York, and obviously, huge in the US market, huge in the European market, global market. And I think that's maybe a good transition to another thing that helped kick off their success in the US market was when Meta, at the time Facebook, adopted them as their primary way of sharing music in their platforms, right? So Spotify really was able to partner with all the big players who knew the right people, whether it was lawyers who knew the right music labels, or whether it was actually the big tech companies or major companies like Coca-Cola that they were able to partner with. So they really climbed to that upper echelon where they were essentially guaranteed to succeed because they were backed by the powers that be, so to say. So that was really interesting. And I guess quick overview as well is one thing they seem to consistently do better than anyone is personalization. So they really, show you your yearly wrap. They show you your explore. They really push a lot of great things. And then one other thing from my perspective that I think is cool about Spotify is they do seem to really back podcasters and content creators to say what they want to say. So during a lot of the Joe Rogan pushback, Spotify was very supportive to Joe Rogan, obviously the largest podcast in the world. And really, Sweden is a country that's very grounded in freedom of speech. So I think that played a big role in their mindset in what they were going to do there. But yeah, really cool to see. And they continue to be very successful. I believe now their financials are doing incredible. I know Daniel Ek tweeted something about it recently, but
something that I found quite interesting though is, it's not something that's currently happening, but I guess something that I wonder is, for how long can we see Spotify at the top? Will they stay at the top? Because if we think about it, personalization was their biggest game plan, or at least from my perspective, the user experience and how fresh and how great it is and was. But now we're seeing like competitors, right? Like YouTube Music, Apple Music, Deezer, they're stepping up their game now, and they're stepping up their user experience. I wonder if that is going to, I don't know, maybe Spotify might suffer a little bit, or maybe they're just so big already that 90% of users who use it, they don't see any going back now. So
unfortunately, I think it's a very competitive space. So, it's nothing I would really be super interested in getting into. But an incredible success story, and a great European digital winner, Swedish digital winner, the most iconic, definitely Swedish company, I would say, in recent times. Okay, let's see if we can pull up Spotify's revenue and profit the last 5 years, because I believe they've actually really been able to increase their profit margin recently. No, of course, really. Is this up to date? So, they've had consistent revenue growth, probably around like 20% a year. They've been growing from 2019 to 2023. So 2023 looks like 13.25 billion euros. But actually, this is the issue at the end of the day, Emmanuel. Is like they're still losing money in terms of net income. Net loss each year. 532 million euros in 2023. So see if they have any more recent data on this. It's funny, these days I turn to LLMs instead of even looking at like stock data because they're so much better at getting me that information.
I'm just looking at Spotify.
So I think this is what I saw Daniel Ek tweeting about, probably because just in 2024, Spotify reported an operating income of 454 million. So that was like a big turn for them, right? It was like finally profitable. You know what I mean? So it's a big shift because they've basically been losing money for years and years and years. Interesting. So I think hopefully we see that for their sake, that they can continue to, make money on this service and still win in this category. Yeah. So great overview of Spotify in the early days. And highly recommend you check out The Playlist on Netflix. Awesome documentary.